Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Go Kim. U.S. President Joe Biden condemned Russia's attack on Ukraine, calling it unprovoked and unjustified. Now, Russian forces are attacking the capital city, Kyiv, while China's Xi Jinping urged Russia's Vladimir Putin to resolve the conflict with Ukraine through negotiations. Putin said he's open to send a delegation for talks. Today, we'll discuss what kind of implications all of this will have on the Korean Peninsula. Joining me is Mark Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick is Associate Fellow and former Executive Director of International Institute for Strategic Studies Americas. He was Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation at the State Department. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the show. Thank you both for your time today.
Glad to be here.
First, Mr. Fitzpatrick, just within a day after Russia started its invasion, Russian missiles are now pounding Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv. The U.S. had been warning about this for a while and had tried to prevent it. Was this premeditated war, as President Biden said?
You know, this is a horrible situation. And yes, it was totally premeditated. It was predicted. Everything President Biden said about this in the preceding weeks has proven to be true. And everything that President Putin said has proven to be a lie. There was no Ukrainian or NATO provocation. Russian troops were not encircling Ukraine as a defensive measure. They were preparing for an offensive invasion, which has now taken place. We're seeing unraveling before our eyes a structure of peace and stability in Europe that we thought we had in the aftermath of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, I mean, the situation is very tragic. Anytime that we're faced with a situation where borders are being contested or trying to be erased, it's a moment of great instability and uncertainty. I'm sure that Vladimir Putin, we see it as a revisionist move. I'm sure that Vladimir Putin sees it as a restorationist move. And I think that the real challenge is that we've seen Putin take measures like this in previous years with Georgia and Crimea, and it appears that an insufficient response was put forward, and that has emboldened Putin to take this next step.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, the U.S. has been saying it'll give a swift, severe, and united response along with its allies when Russia invades Ukraine. The United States, EU, and UK, Canada announced a round of punitive measures against Russian banks and leading companies. What do you make of this? Is this enough?
Well, the sanctions response, I think, is mixed because part of it is a challenge of time frame. When you're dealing with a military incursion or invasion, you're talking about steps that have immediate effect, whereas a sanctions response is one that requires time in order to take effect. And also, I think there was the challenge of trying to build unity around the extent to which sanctions have been put into effect. And we see some gaps, I think, there. But the big issue really is that it's going to be very, I think, challenging for sanctions to be perceived as sufficient in the context of the scale of this particular military invasion.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Fitzpatrick, do you agree with this view? Did the U.S. and allies act in unison on this?
You know, yes, one of the characteristics of the global response to this aggression is that the United States and almost all of its allies are acting in unison. They all but one actually, have applied strict, firm sanctions against Russia. They've kept some things off the sanctions list. Well, yesterday when I was thinking about this, Mr. Putin himself had not yet been sanctioned, but today we have news that the European Union is in fact adding Putin to the list. They're keeping some things in reserve though, because if war crimes, atrocities, more of them are committed, there need to be more sanctions. So there needs to be an escalation. Anyway, we're going to get a little bit later, I think, to South Korea's involvement in this, but so far it's been noticeable that it's not on the list of allies that are acting in strong unison.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, what impact do you expect to see from these sanctions? Will this really stop Russia's attack?
No, unfortunately, the sanctions won't stop Russia's attack. Putin was warned that if he took a move like this, there would be firm sanctions. He did it anyway because, as Scott Snyder said, he has other motives of recouping losses from the Cold War. He wants to reclaim Ukraine, not just as a Russian sphere of influence, but I think he wants to reclaim Ukraine as part of greater Russia. So these sanctions aren't going to stop Putin, but they are firm enough to show many parts of the Russian population that there is a real price to be paid, and the Russian people are speaking out in many ways. So this might, Russian internal dynamics themselves might be the best hope we have for stopping Putin, and the sanctions that impact Russian people are helping motivate them.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, just follow up on that. What should we make of the situation U.S. is not sending its military?
Well, all along, there was no chance that the United States would be sending its military to attack Russia. But they are sending their military to Ukraine's borders. They are beefing up U.S. forces in Europe, and they are preparing various ways of assisting the Ukrainian military. They're now considering whether aid to guerrilla forces in Ukraine if Russia succeeds in overthrowing the government. U.S. is thinking about other ways to fight back against Russia. So I wouldn't say that there's no military, U.S. military response, but Ukraine is not an ally. The United States is not committed in any way to Ukraine's security, and there was never any chance of sending in forces to confront Russia directly.
Mr. Snyder, what's your thought on the measures taken by the U.S. so far?
Well, I think that President Biden has done what he can. I think the most interesting development has been the publicization of intelligence information that provides a clear trail with regards to Putin's intentions. And it's a very difficult issue precisely because, as Mark said, Ukraine is not a U.S. ally. It has become an important part of the fabric in terms of space between Russia and NATO. And perhaps the greatest regret that we might have in hindsight is the need for greater strengthening of the Ukrainian military. I fully agree that insurgency and support for insurgency is likely to play an important role in how this unfolds going forward.
Mr. Snyder, there's quite a distance from Ukraine to the Korean Peninsula, which we actually cover a lot, but it will cause ripple effects there, wouldn't it? What's your assessment?
Well, I think the biggest ripple effect has to do with other states that view borders as contested in Asia. And the two main ones are China vis-a-vis Taiwan and the inter-Korean situation. And so I think the greatest concern when we see efforts to change the map is the possibility of some kind of contagion. But also I think that it's important to highlight China's role in the context of what is happening in Ukraine, because the biggest loophole as regards to sanctions pressure at this point looks like China. And it really highlights the fact that China and Russia have moved closer together. And it may well be that how the events in Ukraine unfold are most affected by the way in which China manages its relationship with Russia.
I think Scott covered the China angle very well. So let me talk about two other ways that there will be ramifications for South Korea. Firstly, there will be global ramifications as there is economic turmoil stemming from the sanctions, and Russia will be applying counter sanctions. Many markets are already tumbling, oil prices are rising, and South Korea, with its dependence on foreign trade, will feel the impact of this economic turmoil. This may be why South Korea's president has been cautious in applying South Korean sanctions of their own, but I hope I have a chance to elaborate my views on that in a moment or two. The other impact is the obvious one, is that South Korea itself was invaded, decades ago, and it still could be invaded in the future. So an invasion of Ukraine far away will be viewed, but on both parts of the Korean peninsula. Kim Jong-un will be watching how it plays out, what kind of support Putin gets, how successful he will be. And I'm not saying that Kim Jong-un is going to do what Putin did, but obviously he'll be watching. And I think the South Koreans should also be watching the kind of solidarity that the world has as it unites to confront Putin's aggression.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, as you have stressed earlier, the U.S. allies across the world are joining the move one by one in order to pressure Russia. And Japan is moving to enact its own sanctions against Russia, while South Korea says it'll join international sanctions, but not considering unilateral measures. How did you take this news?
This timid, tepid approach by South Korea is frankly shameful and unwise. I mean, it's shameful because South Korea, as the previous victim of aggression, was aided massively and saved. And it will be in the future if it ever happens again. It's unwise of South Korea to be conspicuously absent from the list of countries, the list of U.S. allies that have responded forcefully. South Korea it should be playing a major role in crises like this. It's got an economy that's larger than that of Russia, and it's sitting back and saying only going to take multilateral measures. Well, there's not going to be UN sanctions because Russia's going to veto that, but there already are multilateral sanctions. All other US allies have taken steps. Several of them have taken additional unilateral steps. South Korea should step to the plate and do the same.
Mr. Snyder, what's your take on this? Did South Korea come up short, as Mr. Fitzpatrick said?
Well, I think that is right, but I think that what this really is a litmus test for how South Korea sees itself in the world. And I think that what we're seeing is a gap maybe between the way that South Korea has handled these kinds of issues in the past and the types of expectations that accompany South Korea's status as being in the top 10 in terms of economic scale and broader power. And what I think we see is that in the past, South Korea has tended to keep its head down and focus on its own specific narrow economic interests. But South Korea really is at a point where it needs to hold the line. And I think that this reveals, the response reveals something about South Korea's growing pains and the challenge of living up to the scale and importance that South Korea now plays in the world.
There are some concerns how the Ukraine situation will be taken by North Korea. The U.S. Republican congressmen are calling on the Biden administration to act more strongly, saying that the countries like China, Iran, and North Korea are watching closely. Mr. Snyder, is North Korea watching closely?
Yeah, I think North Korea is watching very closely, and I think we should all be concerned about the sorts of lessons that North Korea may be taking from the Ukrainian conflict. First of all, Ukraine had been offered in the 1990s by the US as an example in terms of negative security assurances that a state could get from giving up nuclear weapons. And so I think that North Korea is probably going to add Ukraine to Libya and Iraq as reasons why it doesn't want to give up nuclear weapons. Also, I'm concerned about how North Korea is viewing Putin's elliptical threat about the potential use of nuclear weapons in the case of a spreading conflict resulting from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think that North Korea is probably watching that situation very closely as well.
Yes, I think Dr. Snyder expressed it well. North Korea is not going to launch an invasion because Putin was successful. The circumstances are very different, and surely Kim Jong-un knows that the U.S. has a security commitment to an ally that it didn't have with a non-ally Ukraine. But there are various aspects of this conflict that North Korea may draw lessons from. One of them will be in the cyber realm. We haven't seen too much news yet, but I expect that in the coming days, Russia will, if it hasn't done so already, will have launched a massive cyber attack to try to take down Ukrainian institutions. This is one area where North Korea might seek to derive some lessons about how cyber attacks can be effective. Even absent any conflict in the Korean Peninsula, North Korea has used cyber attacks for its own purposes, and I expect it will continue to do so.
Then, do you see the possibility that North Korea will take this crisis as an opportunity to escalate its threats?
No, I don't think it will do that necessarily. North Korea has its own motivations and timetable for the kind of threats that it has been engaging in. The missile tests that we saw last month in rapid succession were probably scheduled because of the technological needs of the North Korean military, or the desires to improve their missiles to have a deterrence. And I think we're going to see more such missile tests of more powerful and longer range missiles. And North Korea would be doing that regardless of what happens a continent away.
Well, I agree with what Mark said, that really North Korea operates on its own timetable for its own purposes, but it's also aware of the broader environment. And the Ukrainian situation, the biggest impact is really that the US is going to be distracted. And I do think that there is a concern that North Korea could try to take advantage of that distraction. I think that's one reason why Secretary Blinken, in his recent trip to Australia and Hawaii, met with his counterparts from Japan and South Korea to try to send a message that the U.S. did not want to see opportunistic responses as Ukrainian tensions escalated.
Mm-hmm. Just related to what you just said, obviously the U.S. is now more focused on Ukraine. Does the U.S. have room to think about what North Korea is doing?
I think the U.S. has room. Of course, at the very top level, the most valuable commodity is the time of the president. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a capability within the U.S. bureaucracy to manage multiple challenges. The real issue is that the North Korean issue is not ripe. And there's a lot of things that can be done in order to move the situation forward if North Korea is willing to engage. But I think the fact that the president is preoccupied may be the factor that the North Koreans end up being most focused on.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Fitzpatrick, does the U.S. have the capacity to handle both issues at the same time?
Oh, yeah, they certainly have the capacity. The United States bureaucracy is deep and strong and experienced and knowledgeable. And the Biden administration has a very capable team, some of whom we don't hear much of, but would be critical players in an evolving crisis in North Korea. I think, for example, of Kurt Campbell, coordinator for Asia at the White House. We don't hear much about him. I know he's busy doing good work, but people like him would rise to the fore. But as Scott said, yeah, the president's time is limited. And this could mean that they want to fight one war at a time. But in the past, the United States has fought two wars at a time. There were world wars where they had to meet aggression on all fronts, and they did so successfully.
This is my final question for today. Mr. Fitzpatrick, this is really grave, unfortunate situation to talk about, but what should we be prepared to see now?
Some people were thinking that there wouldn't be an invasion. I was hoping there wouldn't be an invasion. All of our worst fears have so far come to pass, and there are more fears that I have that I think we will be seeing in the coming days. Russia is going to take Ukraine. They're going to topple the government. They're going to seek to topple the government. I shouldn't say they're going to take Ukraine. They're going to certainly try to. They're going to try to seize Kyiv. They're going to try to seize all the airports. They're going to try to topple leadership. And then the Ukrainian people are going to be pushing back informally through guerrilla tactics, and they will get support from the West for this. So I think we're going to see probably a longer conflict, a dirty conflict. And my hope is that the Russian people will increasingly speak out against this, and Putin will realize that far from gaining, he is losing his own people. That's a hope, though. It's not necessarily a prediction.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, your final thoughts?
Well, I think this is an extraordinarily fluid situation, and it is volatile, and unexpected things can come out from a situation like this that can also have ramifications for the Korean Peninsula. But I think that in the near term, it's true that the main focus is going to be on how to try to stabilize this situation. And we don't really know how long that is going to take. And with regards to the North Korea situation, I think that the primary focus is probably going to be on trying to maintain a measure of stability as the world focuses on Ukraine. And we'll have to see whether the North Koreans do something surprising or whether opportunity comes from this crisis.
The international community is condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine with one voice, urging Russia's President Putin to stop this aggression. All eyes are on Ukraine, as many people are anxious to see whether the US and its allies will be able to resolve this crisis. Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Very pleased to be with VOA Korea Service.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.